Over the past 2 years, I've been reading a lot of books about game development, and in this video I want to give you my suggestions of game dev books you should read in 2026. We'll go over programming, art, game design, books related specifically to Unreal Engine, and then close it out with some of my special recommendations. Now let's get right into it with my first suggestion, which is Game Programming Patterns. It was written by Bob Nystrom, who used to be a programmer at Electronic Arts and now works on the Dart programming language. This book will teach you how to make your code cleaner, easier to understand, and faster, while also staying realistic and admitting that writing well-architected code takes time and that it's important to strike a balance between clean architecture and getting things done. It takes a lot of inspiration from Design Patterns, which was written by the Gang of Four and had a huge impact on software development as a whole when it released in 1994. But while Game Programming Patterns also uses some of the patterns introduced more than 3 decades ago, it often puts a modern spin on things and chooses specific examples that are best suited for game development. All of the information here is very practical and applies even when working with game engines such as Unity, Godot, and Unreal. For example, the game loop pattern is related to the update function in Unity or the tick event in Unreal. You've probably also heard about singletons or used the pattern without even knowing when working with a game instance or game mode. And object pooling is something that most types of games can benefit from instantly. Game Programming Patterns is available as a physical book, digitally in many different formats, and it can also be read for free on the official website, link in the description. Sticking with programming, I want to talk about object-oriented programming, often shortened to OOP, which all of you have been using without even knowing it. Every time you make a new blueprint class in Unreal, override an event, or pretty much anything you do is based on OOP, so it definitely makes sense to expand your knowledge on this topic. According to this poll which I put out on YouTube a while ago, about 50% of you don't know what OOP is at all or only have a very basic understanding of it. When it comes to books about OOP, the best one is sadly only available in Japanese. It's called オブジェクト思考でなぜ作るのか、しておきたい OOP 設計アジャイル開発の基礎知識. I'm about 70% done with it at this point and it's been absolutely amazing so far. When it comes to English books about this topic, the object-oriented design process seems to be the best option, but according to the reviews, there is some outdated or incorrect information. Nevertheless, I think it will still do a decent job at covering the base concepts and make you understand a bit better what you're actually doing whenever you create a new class in your game. And by the way, the two classics, Design Patterns and Clean Code, will also help you get a better understanding of OOP. However, they're a bit more advanced and the base concepts of OOP are not the main focus here. Next up, let's talk about game art. In my opinion, Pixel Logic is still hands down the best book on pixel art and I still come back to it every couple of months. Instead of being a step-by-step tutorial, it more so focuses on fundamentals, important concepts, and covers specific techniques you might want to use. And it does so over the course of roughly 240 pages, often using art from games we all know and love as examples. It will teach you about canvas sizes, dithering, perspective, outline styles, anti-aliasing, and many more things that I could ever mention here. It was written by Micha Frar, who created pixel art for projects such as Wargroove, Super Meat Boy Forever, and Cassette Beasts. And while he's great at pixel art and teaching about it, he's not that great at marketing and letting people know about this amazing book. So I put an affiliate link in the description where you can get the ebook version to support him and myself as well. While doing research on Octopath Traveler, I came across a magazine called CG World, which features in-depth breakdowns of graphic techniques taught directly by the developers. In the case of Octopath, it goes into how they used Photoshop's Puppet Warp function to create hundreds of characters at a low cost, the texturing process and indoor systems for their buildings, how they created VFX using Unreal's Cascade system, and much more. I also have this other issue which uses Sega games as examples to break down the fundamentals of 3D computer-generated graphics in an easy-to-understand manner. And I wish I came across this when I first got into game development because it would have saved me months of just going through random YouTube videos. Even though this magazine is also sadly only available in Japanese, if you find an issue about a game you're really interested in, it might actually be worth getting it and translating it by yourself, just because of high quality and exclusive the information here can be. When it comes to game design, the 3 classic books everybody recommends are A Theory of Fun for Game Design, which I talked about in my last video about game dev books about a year ago, and looking back at it now, I think this one is a decent introduction, but the lessons it teaches aren't instantly actionable and I think it's probably the weakest of the bunch. Level Up, the Guide to Great Video Game Design, is the one that I haven't read yet and might read this year, but it seems to be very detail-oriented, teaching you how to write a game design document, breaking down controls, different types of cameras, UI elements, and so on. And the one I read in 2025 is The Art of Game Design, a Book of Lenses, which I can wholeheartedly recommend to anyone regardless of your level of experience. The best thing about this book is that it doesn't just teach you vague ideas or the fundamentals of game design, but it teaches you a set of lenses or angles you can use to look at your game, analyze it, and make improvements. For example, you could use the lens of novelty, which brings up the following questions. What is novel about my game? Does my game have novelties throughout or just the beginning? Do I have the right mix of the novel and the familiar? And this might make you realize that the player can see and do everything in your game during the first 30 minutes. And a possible fix for this would be to maybe spread out the introduction of new enemy types and abilities throughout more levels instead of front-loading everything, creating a better interest curve. On the official website, which I'll also link below, you can go through the 113 lenses, which might even be useful if you haven't read the book yet. And yeah, this is not the one and done kind of book, but you can come back to it again and again if something feels off with your game to analyze it through these lenses and make improvements. Another book publisher I came across last year is Bitmap Books, and I picked up their ultimate guide to side-scrolling beat-em-ups and their guide on Japanese role-playing games. These are aimed at game collectors and enthusiasts rather than game developers, but reading through them will give you a wide overview of the history of certain genres and how they developed, which can give you a frame of reference for game design or just inspire and motivate you to put in the work on your own projects. While I was working on my beat-em-up prototype, I often played other games of this genre to break down the game design and animations, and I thought I knew every single beat-em-up out there. But after flipping through the pages of this book, I noticed that I've only scratched the surface, and checking out some of the lesser-known titles gave me a couple of good ideas for character archetypes or possible special moves. And when I started working on my JRPG Masterclass course, which by the way you can also check out from the link in the description, I picked up the Guide to JRPGs to gain a better understanding on how the different systems we all know nowadays came to be and what is actually essential for making a JRPG. But on top of that, it was also a great reference for looking into different styles of pixel art and how it evolved over the years. These books are super high quality and I might pick up a few more in the following years, so if you want to check them out, there's also a link in the description to these. A genre of books that I've often overlooked are strategy guides. Of course, they're made for players who want to learn strategies to beat a certain game, but at the same time, they are basically reverse engineering the game design in order to figure out the best strategies. The guide, which had by far the strongest influence on me and can be felt in pretty much all of my games and tutorials, is the Rindokan Bible, which I read for the first time about 15 years ago. This is a guide on how to play Makoto in Street Fighter 4, but by breaking down all of her moves into numbers and hitboxes, it really made me understand what happens behind the scenes during combat interactions in games. Every melee attack you make in any game will need to follow the pattern of startup, active frames, and recovery, and you'll also need an understanding of hit stun and hit stop to create rewarding and balanced combat. A lack of understanding this is what makes so many student projects and indie games that feature combat just feel unrewarding, and reading through the Rindokan Bible countless times really hammered in all of these concepts for me. Recently, I also started picking up a bunch of random strategy guides I could find in used bookstores, and outside of things such as frame data, they often also come with big zoomed out maps that could be a reference for level design, collections of pixel art, and sometimes even interviews with developers to give you some insight on how these games were made. So I definitely suggest you keep an eye open for these, since you can often get them pretty cheap at secondhand stores. I've looked far and wide for books related to Unreal Engine, but there really isn't all that much out there, and the most interesting one I found is Control Freak, My Epic Adventures Making Jazz Jackrabbit, Gears of War, Unreal and Fortnite by Cliff Bleszinski. And as you can probably tell, this is not a technical book, but rather the autobiography of Cliff Bleszinski, who was one of the first members of Epic Games, back then still called Epic Mega Games. It starts with Cliff's origin story and then with how his connection to Epic Games formed, with him sending out a letter with a floppy disk to Tim Sweeney. It covers the whole Jazz Jackrabbit era and then goes into a game just called Unreal, which birthed the first version of Unreal Engine. And then also goes over Unreal Tournament, Gears of War, how Fortnite came to be, and many other interesting topics. So while this book won't really teach you how to use Unreal Engine, it will give you a lot of insight on the history of the engine, the design process of some of the most popular games made with it, and it also chronicles many interactions between Cliff and other members of Epic Games. And as an honorable mention, since I haven't read this one yet, there is a book called Unreal Engine 5 Collision Essentials by fellow Unreal course creator and YouTuber Stephen Olibari, which aims to demystify Unreal's collision framework by explaining exactly how things work behind the scenes. And outside of these, you have ebook guides by Pact, but they're basically just something that should have been a YouTube tutorial forced into the form of a book, and half of it is just screenshots telling you where to click, so I don't think these are worth looking into. Now lastly, let's get into my special recommendations, which are a bit out there, so even though you're probably not gonna read these, I just want you to know that these actually exist, and that alone is pretty cool. The first one is a manga called Developas Game Sousaku Numa e Yokoso, which would probably be called Developers Welcome to the Game Development Rabbit Hole if it ever gets an English release. This manga follows the story of a young man called Ito who is employed at a game company as a programmer, but after joining an indie game event, which I think is supposed to be Tokyo Game Dungeon, and meeting a girl called Haruka who's making a pixel art action game in Unity, he gets involved in making indie games. This manga is actually shockingly accurate in its depiction of the Japanese indie dev scene and the tools used to make games, and the event shown here is just straight up Tokyo Indies at Mogura. The pixel art software used here is obviously Sprite, and this is just the Unity editor. It's actually also a bit educational since it uses quite realistic numbers when it goes into budgeting, Steam pages, and marketing through social media. So definitely keep your eyes open for this one getting an English translation or an anime adaptation. And while we're at the topic of manga, I also picked up the one about Masahiro Sakurai, who among other things is the director of the Smash Bros. Series and a huge inspiration for me. And while I haven't read this one yet, it seems to cover his entire game dev history all the way up to his YouTube escapades and the new Kirby Air Riders. Another technical book I picked up but haven't read yet is Sega style-based linear algebra course. And yeah, I don't know, I was expecting this one to be more like the issue of CG World I talked about before, using real examples from Sega games to visualize things. But no, this is basically just a very dry book on linear algebra, the way they teach it to fresh grads when they first enter the company. But hey, now you know this is a thing that actually exists, so that is kind of cool. And if you want some more book recommendations, you can check out the video I made last year featuring a few other ones. As always, a huge thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members.